this just happened half an hour ago. I came back to my hometown for the holidays. It's a fairly rural area with woods, and everything is peaceful. I love going to pick wild berries, and I was doing just that when I encountered the first paranormal experience of my life. It happened in the backyard of my neighbor. There are wild berry shrubs there. Here are a few details so that the story makes sense. I used to have an old man who lived alone as my neighbor, and he was a very kind person. He used to give us those berries as candied sweets. He passed away due to cardiac failure when I was in high school, and his house has been empty ever since. I wanted to make those sweets for my family as holiday comfort food and thus went to his place. Now, as he passed a few years ago, there was a lot of undergrowth and wild grass in his yard, and everything was messy. I cleared some of the growth and made my way to the shrubs, cleaning the place as much as I could, thinking about how clean he used to keep everything. All this time, I had a feeling that something was off and that I was being watched, but I brushed it off. I was 2 minutes into picking when I heard my neighbor's voice. I'm sure it was him, saying I should be more careful and to pick up the rake immediately. It was as if I was fainting, everything was fast or slow, and I can't really explain that. But as soon as I picked up the rake, some homeless man tried to stab me with a knife. I used the sharp end of the rake to scare him off and kept shouting loudly. He ran off. After I gathered myself, I had tears but couldn't shake off a smile I had. It was eerie, but I am unharmed. I think I'm going to clean my neighbor's place. I owe him that much.
So, I saw this about 4 years ago at work, and it creeped me the heck out. I work for a digital surveillance company that runs the eye in the sky for thousands of restaurants, bars, and gas stations across the US. From time to time, we get calls for investigations to look into robberies, theft, etc. One day, we get a call from a popular fast food chain located in the heart of Detroit. They say an employee OD'd by the dumpster, and they needed us to get some answers on the situation. Firstly, what happened, and how long was he there? The next question is where it starts to get weird. You see, the dumpster had a brick wall around it, with 2 entrances. There was a gate you had to pass when you walked out the back door. And the big gates where the garbage truck has access to the dumpster to empty it out. They claimed those big gates were always open, and the small gate by the back door was locked from the inside. Nobody ever used that smaller gate. The weird thing was when the body was found, an employee walked out, that gate that was never open was indeed open, and the body was sitting there on full display. So their next question was who the heck opened that gate? We downloaded the footage. One night, the employee goes outside, throws out the trash, and you can kinda see him through the locked gate that was never open. It was see-through but very difficult to see through. The way the camera was angled. You could kinda see over the top also. He injects himself, slumps over, and keels over dead behind the dumpster. He was out there for 2.5 days. No employees ever come to look for him. It's pouring rain both days. For 2 days, employees come and go, taking out the trash and not seeing him. Then, on the 3rd day in the morning sunshine, clear as day, the gate just slowly opens by itself. Nobody comes, nobody goes. The gate just opens by itself, and the body is sitting there in the same position it was 2.5 days earlier. I literally felt chills down my spine. To this day, I can't explain it without thinking it was paranormal. Anyway, a couple of hours later, an employee walks out with a trash bag, sees the body, freaks out, and calls the police. I didn't write it, but we basically had to write a report on how a gate apparently opened itself.
I work closely with one other person throughout most workdays, and today, we got to work early because we knew we had to get things done before the snow hit. I work at a burial vault manufacturer, and we deliver and set up funerals graveside if the customer wishes. Well, on this morning, I walked to the back and turned on the lights to each section of the shop. On the very last switch, I turned it on, and I saw an older gentleman facing away from me, leaning against the back wall and looking toward the back of the shop. It startled me, and I turned around to ask my coworker if there was someone in the shop. My coworker kind of laughed as I told him, and he said, "Oh, so you saw him? Did you?" Apparently, it's the owner's father, who has strong ties to the workplace and has been dead for 10 years. There have been 3 recorded sightings of him, and mine was the 4th. I'm fairly new there, so this completely caught me off guard. I felt like I was dreaming. I had to sit in the bathroom for 10 minutes to calm down. I literally saw someone back there and then disappear. I've always thought ghosts and spirits were a bit much, but this has completely turned me sideways. I see life in a whole new way. I can't stop thinking about him, though. Those blue overalls and white hair with a cap on, clear as day right there, and it was a ghost. My coworker telling me he saw him too has turned me into a believer because I know I'm not losing my mind.
My grandfather died in 2019 after 4 years of wasting away with a terrible illness. On his deathbed, he was adamant that we were to get his pickup truck after his passing. We've all been terribly protective of this truck. It was his baby. He bought it brand new in 2006 and only put 45,000 miles on it in the time he had it. He always made sure it was fully up to par and maintained. Not a scratch on it. Shortly after we received it, my mother and I were waiting in a CVS drive-thru when an old, beat-up Ford rolled into the back of us. Not terribly hard, but enough to dent the bumper pretty damn good. It was an older gentleman, and he was apologizing profusely. He explained he had just gotten out of the hospital and had been looking for some paperwork on his passenger seat and hadn't realized the truck was rolling. He was obviously exhausted and unwell. When we exchanged insurance, it became even more apparent that this man had fallen on hard times. My mother and I didn't really want to go after this guy. It was obvious he was very poor. But we also had guilt over my grandfather's truck now having a terrible dent in the bumper, and though it was cosmetic, the repairs would be at least $300, and we don't have that kind of money. That night, for the first and last time, I dreamed of my grandfather. He was healthy with a beer in his hand, and we were sitting in the backyard of his house. We made small talk, and eventually, he asked if we were enjoying the truck. I told him what happened, and he chuckled. Took a sip of his beer, and said, "You know, it's just a truck." I woke up after that. That day, my mother told me she decided not to go after the guy, and when I asked why, she said that I might have thought it was silly, but that night she had dreamed of my grandfather, sitting in his backyard with a beer in hand, smiling, and telling her not to worry about it. It is just a truck.
So one night, my wife, son, and I went to stay over at my wife's parents' house. It had gotten dark, and my son, about 2 at the time, got sleepy, so I decided to put him to bed. Let me try to explain the room to you, relevant for later. The door opens on the right side of the room. Immediately to your left is the light switch, and the queen-size bed is just beside that. It's a small room, just big enough for the bed and enough room to walk around the bed. The wall in front of the bed has a window. To the left of the bed is a closet with those weird accordion doors. I'm lying in bed with the lights out, with my son who is laying his head on my arm. He finally falls asleep, and I just lie there for a few minutes to make sure he is completely out. Then out of nowhere, I get this horrible feeling, goosebumps, hair standing up on my neck and arms. It was such an evil feeling. Have you ever got goosebumps on your scalp where it feels like your scalp is shrinking? I did that night, so bad, in fact, it literally felt like someone had a hand on my head, squeezing it. I was genuinely scared, not so much for me but for my son. Somehow I knew deep down if I turned away from my son, something bad would happen to him. I thought if I could turn on the light, I could grab my son and leave the room. So where I was on the bed, I could just barely touch the plastic bezel thing on the light switch. I was afraid to move because I knew if I did, whatever this thing is, it would get my son. His head was on my arm this whole time, so I finally chanced it. I jerked my arm out from my son and turned on the light. It honestly took a split second. When I turned back to grab him, he was at the bottom of the mattress, like something had pulled him from the top to the bottom in a split freaking second. And I know he didn't crawl down there because he was still fast asleep, so I grabbed him up, and we left the room and slept in the front room that night.